Hello. In this video, I'm going to introduce some of the features of the invoicing that you can access in the Travel Tracker. Now, as you may know, the Travel Tracker does fully encompass an invoicing process from the creation of the invoice, through the payment of the invoice, through the reconciliation of that payment perhaps, and it can involve not only your perhaps bookkeepers at your school locations. It can also involve finance or your business office, and we have lots of different flexibility built in to the invoicing. So hopefully we can encompass anyone's current procedure and process that they use for invoicing. Now, the first thing to consider today is who will be my contact for working through the invoicing piece. There are some districts that finance needs to be involved. They may know more about the process. Transportation sometimes just comes up with a cost of the trip, and then that's as far as they really go. And then some districts, transportation is completely involved in the entire process. And so if it is that case, then that's fine. We'll just keep going with this video and talking to transportation. If it's someone else that we need to be talking to, perhaps someone in finance or your business office, that's fine too. Just let us know. If we need to reach out to that individual, give me their name and contact information, and we'll reach out to them and go through this piece of the Travel Tracker with them. Now, the invoicing in Travel Tracker, like I said, is very flexible. The invoices are created as soon as an assignment is made, and the invoices just kind of hang out in the Invoices tab until the trip has occurred, and then someone, usually in transportation, will go in and fill in some details from that particular trip about perhaps mileage or maybe drivers, cost, and just depending again on how you want to do your costing. And then we'll send these invoices perhaps to the school bookkeepers or maybe just to finance. Again, it depends on the way you do business and your process there in your district. So if you are doing invoicing, we need to think about some things before we get ready for our next discovery call. One thing to think about if you're doing invoicing is who is going to manage those invoices after the trip has occurred, who is going to go in and put in the information. And also what information is important in the invoice. How do you charge for your trips? Do you just charge for the vehicle use, maybe based on mileage? Are you reimbursing for driver time, fuel cost? How are you charging for your trips? If you are charging for your vehicle use by the mileage, what is your rate per mile? Is the rate different depending on the type of trip? Field trip rate may be different from an athletic trip rate, may be different from a staff trip rate. So if you have different rates, consider that. What will your invoice flow be? We've talked about, transportation is going to create the invoice and approve it for payment. What happens to it after that? In some districts, that invoice needs to go to the schools where they perhaps write a check. And then the bookkeeper at the school will send the check to perhaps finance, who would then reconcile that check and then maybe come back into the Travel Tracker and mark the invoice paid. Maybe the bookkeepers are going to write checks and mark the invoice payment sent, and then send the check back to transportation, and transportation will be responsible for marking the invoice paid. Maybe you won't take the invoice through all of those statuses, all the way through the paid status. Maybe it'll stop at the payment sent status after the bookkeepers look at it. Some districts don't have bookkeepers writing checks, but they want the bookkeepers to see the invoice cost. and just acknowledge by marking it payment sent that they know this is a cost, but that finance is going to be doing maybe budget transfers with their accounting software. Other districts don't involve the school bookkeepers at all, and they come up with a cost for the trips, and they just send that cost information to the finance office or the business office, and they do budget transfers. Your flow, your procedure with the invoice could be very different from someone else's in other districts. That's one thing we know, is that everyone seems to do business just a little bit differently. So we've tried to build in as much flexibility as we can into the invoice. So another thing to think about is, do you want to have a way for your users or your approvers to indicate funding sources and perhaps account codes or budget codes that are going to be paying for the trips. So that will be another area that we will be kind of thinking about, and I'm going to give you a little bit more information about that. But before we do, let me give you just a brief tour of the invoice itself, so you can kind of have an idea about what the invoice is like, and maybe it'll help you as you're thinking about these different questions. So here is an example of the invoice. Notice that the top section of the invoice just has the details of the trip, the school that went on the trip, where they went, the date and the time of the trip. The vehicle information is here. There is this funding that has been indicated, and that funding can be selected as early as when the requester submits the request, or it can come in a little later with an approver. Maybe the first or second level approver would pick the funding source, or maybe they don't know until the invoice, and then whoever creates the invoice is selecting the funding source. So lots of flexibility there. Costing information is the next part of the invoice. This first section is for driver cost. So if you do reimburse your drivers for their time, that information can be included. In this example, we're paying this driver for 5 hours at a rate of $15 an hour, and all of this information can auto-populate from your driver table. We are paying this driver benefits, so we can accommodate that to come up with a driver cost. So whoever is going to be managing your invoices, they would need to come in and include the number of driver hours. If you're going to be charging for the use of the vehicle based on the number of miles driven, that can be added into your invoice. You can put in odometer readings to come up with the actual miles driven, and then whatever your cost per mile is to come up with a mileage cost. Some districts don't charge per mile, some districts just charge for fuel, and so we can calculate the cost for fuel based on the miles per gallon that the fuel or that the vehicle uses, and the cost of the gallon of gas or fuel. So that can be added in. These last two sections here are just give the invoice a lot of flexibility. We can add in additional vehicle cost or invoice cost that can be very random and flexible. But eventually that total cost is determined, just however you need it, whatever costing information you need to combine to come up with your total cost. The invoice can keep a history of all of the statuses and who has marked the invoice and who has been in and indicated that they have seen the invoice. We see an electronic signature of whoever approves this invoice. That'd be someone at transportation. If someone marked it payment sent, one of the bookkeepers at the school, that information is there, that electronic signature, and then whoever marked it paid, maybe someone in finance or your business office. It could be someone in transportation came in and marked it paid, but you can see all of the history of that and how this invoice moved through the flow that was determined. So we've got that kind of idea of what the invoice looks like. Now, I do want to circle back to the funding information now, and let's talk a little bit more about that and kind of give you an idea of the funding. So we're going to actually look at a request form in order to do that. So let's take a look at a request. So this is the request form and the section of the request form that includes the funding source. And like I mentioned earlier, the funding source can be selected by the requester, or this section could be hidden from the requester, and the approvers are responsible for selecting the funding source if it needs to be indicated. Notice that we can accommodate up to 2 funding sources. So if you needed to be able to allow your schools to share the cost between 2 schools, you can indicate that. Now, we do have some options on how we set up your funding sources and the account codes that may or may not be associated with them. The first option could be where you have funding sources with account codes or budget codes associated with them. So an example of that in this drop down, might be CTE, and then notice that it will automatically associate the account code with that particular funding source. So we could have it show that way. Another option might include not only the budget code but an approver. Could be added into the approval flow. If we use this particular funding source, then this particular individual needs to have access to the request form and approve it with the use of that particular money. So that's one option. Another option would be to include allotments. So if you have any funding sources that have some allotments set up to it, then the requester or the approver can see an estimated balance left in that particular allotment. In this example, we also have an account code and an approver associated with this type of funding source that has an allotment set up with it. Another type of funding source, this is the third option, really usually only includes one funding source but multiple budget codes or account codes that are available to that particular school. So this would be a district whose maybe the bookkeepers at the school, they know their account codes and which ones they can use and what the account codes can be used for. So in this example, we would choose just district budget codes and then see a list of account codes that I can use. Now with the account code set up this way, your requesters will only see account codes that have their school location code in it. Or their school code in it. So in my example here, my school code is 348. So I'm only seeing accounts that have 348 in them because those are ones for my school. So if I'm the bookkeeper here, I would see my school's account codes, and then maybe I'm looking at a program code or an object code or something like that, and I know these, and I'm able to select the one that applies to this particular trip. So that's the third option. The fourth option is basically just a way for you to indicate maybe just a funding source, and you just want to put a name of the title of that funding source. No account codes, no allotments or approvers or anything like that. Now we can set up these just a plain title. We can set up the budget code field to be editable so that if it was necessary, they could key in their account code so the budget code field could be editable. And so we can set them up that way as well, or they could put anything in here, a check number or just anything that would make sense with the way that your system or your district would do business that way. So those are four of the 4 options that we have to set up with your funding sources and account codes. Now we're going to go into more detail on this and try to explain it during our call. I will attach those 4 options that I just showed you. I'll attach a little document that kind of goes into that, explains that a little bit. And now I'm not anticipating that you will have this information ready during our discovery call. We'll need to talk through it a little more. But it will just give you something to think about, and kind of maybe if you wanted to review that attachment about the different options on the funding source, give you a little bit of a foundational understanding of how we can set those up, and you of course would know your account codes and what you need better than I will. So maybe seeing some of these options, you will be able to kind of have thought about that and be able to point us in the way that you think that these options should be set up. Let me just mention that you don't have to just pick one and that's the one you stay with. There's 4 options you can mix and match in your system how that particular funding source should work. So that can be also helpful. And also I want to mention with the funding sources that we can set up your funding sources and make them only available to certain locations. So we can make them location specific and or trip type specific. So maybe some funding sources only show up to certain schools, maybe only certain schools on certain types of trips. So this is the high schools for athletic trips only, or something like that. So we've got a lot of flexibility and options that you can work with your funding sources. So, but we'll talk more about that when we have our call. So that is your task today, is to take a look at your calendars, go to the Calendly link, and schedule our next discovery call where we will talk about invoicing and funding sources perhaps. So go ahead and schedule that call, and once you have scheduled the call, mark this task done, and we look forward to meeting with you again to talk about invoicing and funding sources. Thank you so much.